Wyoming Territory, summer of 1879. The wind carried dust and secrets across the dry stretch of land between Fort Laramie and the foothills, where the cottonwoods held tight to the riverbanks. Keziah Hale stood behind the counter of her modest mercantile in the town of Rivet Creek, sleeves rolled to her elbows, her dark hair twisted up in a coil that had come loose in the heat. She was 25, quiet, steady, and always kind, but no one in town really knew her. That was how she kept it. She had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let anyone get close enough to ask questions, especially about the little boy asleep in the back room. Dawson was 7, all knees and elbows and questions. Folks in town thought he was her younger brother. That was the story she had told when she arrived 3 years ago with nothing but 2 trunks, a sick child, and a mule that died the next day. People believed it because she made them believe it. But Dawson was not her brother. He was her son. She had never spoken the name of Dawson's father, not since the day she walked away from the life she had known in Missouri. He had married someone else, left her with a belly full of shame and no place to go. She had not cried when the riverboat pulled away from St. Louis. She had cried later when Dawson was born and she thought maybe she would not live through it. But she had. And she had not looked back since. The bell above the door jingled, pulling her from her thoughts. A man stepped inside, tall and sun-browned, his boots coated in dust and his hat held respectfully in his hand. He moved like someone used to riding long and sleeping short. His eyes were a steady gray blue and they landed on her with quiet curiosity. "Afternoon," he said, voice low and even. "You got any horseshoe nails?" Keziah nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "Second shelf, right past the feed sacks." He nodded and moved toward them. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He was not like the other cowhands who passed through. He did not stare or make sharp comments under his breath. He moved with calm purpose, like someone who had seen hard things and decided to be kind anyway. He brought the nails to the counter. "Name's Elias Tripp," he said as he set them down. "Working cattle over at the Drayton Ranch. Broke a shoe coming through the pass. Keziah Hale." She slid the nails into a small cloth sack and tied it off. "That will be 15 cents. He paid and hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the back room where Dawson sometimes played with tin soldiers. "You run this place alone," she nodded. "Always have. That your boy back there?" The question knotted something in her stomach. She gave a tight smile. "My brother," Elias nodded once, slow. "Looks like you take good care of him." She handed him the sack. Their fingers brushed and something passed between them, nothing loud, nothing spoken. Just a pause, a recognition. He tipped his hat and left. That night, after she tucked Dawson into his cot and read him 2 pages from the old Bible with the broken spine, she sat by the window with a cup of tea she had let go cold. The moon cast pale light across the rooftops of Rivet Creek, and the wind stirred the leaves of the cottonwood outside. She could still feel the brush of Elias's fingers. The next few days passed with quiet rhythm, customers, deliveries, tending to Dawson's schooling herself. She had no friends, but she had peace. That had always been enough. Until she found Elias outside her shop one morning holding a small wooden box. "I make things," he said simply, offering it to her. Inside was a carved horse no bigger than her palm with fine detail and smooth lines. "Thought your brother might like it," Keziah swallowed. "He will, thank you." "You mind if I stop by sometime? I do not know many folks here yet." She hesitated, but something in his voice, gentle and patient, made her nod. "You can stop by." He started coming every few days, sometimes with a new carving, sometimes with small repairs she needed and could not do herself. He never asked questions. He always looked her in the eye. Dawson took to him quickly, and Elias never once treated him like a burden. He taught him how to tie proper knots, how to hold a hammer, how to find north without a compass. Keziah watched the way her son looked up at him, wide-eyed and trusting. One afternoon, Elias sat on the porch steps, Dawson beside him, both working on carving a fox from a piece of pine. Keziah stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "You are good with him," she said quietly. Elias looked up. He is a good boy." Keziah met his eyes, and for the first time something in her unraveled. She wanted to tell him, but she could not. Not yet. That night Dawson woke coughing, a deep, rattling sound that shook his small frame. Keziah sat by his side all night, holding a wet cloth to his forehead, whispering soothing words through clenched teeth. She had thought he had outgrown the lung sickness, but it had come back. By morning, she knew she needed help. The doctor was 3 towns over and had not come through in weeks. She ran to the Drayton ranch just after dawn, her skirts soaked from dew, her chest heaving. Elias was already saddling his horse. "Keziah," his voice held surprise and concern. "It is Dawson," she said, breathless. "He is coughing again, bad. I do not know what to do." He was already mounting up. "Show me." He followed her back to the shop and carried Dawson into the light where he could see his face. "We need to get him to clean air. Pine trees, higher ground. I know a cabin in the hills. Used to belong to an old trail boss. It is empty now, but it has a stove and clean spring water. We can get him there by nightfall." Keziah nodded. "I will pack what I can." They rode out just past noon, Elias with Dawson cradled in front of him, Keziah close behind, her heart pounding. Dust rose behind them, and the sun beat down as they climbed higher into the hills. By nightfall, they reached the cabin. Elias laid Dawson in the bed and stoked the fire. Keziah stood by the window, arms wrapped tight around herself. "You should know," she said finally, voice barely above a whisper. "He is not my brother, he is my son." Elias turned, his eyes steady on hers. "I figured," she blinked. "You did. People do not run this far unless they are protecting something." He stepped closer. "You do not have to explain. I have seen enough to know what shame looks like, but I do not see it in you. I see someone brave." Her breath caught. "I never told anyone. You told me now." She looked at him, the firelight catching the curve of his jaw, the steady calm of his eyes. She had feared this moment for so long. Thought it would cost her everything, but Elias just reached out and took her hand. "I am not going anywhere," he said, and for the first time in years she let herself believe it. The first morning in the hills broke cool and fragrant, with thin gray light trickling through the pines. Keziah stepped quietly across the cabin's plank floor, her bare feet careful on the cold wood. Elias had left the door cracked to let in the clean air, and the breeze carried the scent of damp earth and spruce resin. She found him outside near the spring, crouched beside a kettle warming on a makeshift stone hearth. He looked up when she approached, his face drawn from lack of sleep, but alert. "He rested some after you dozed off," he said, voice low to keep from carrying inside. Breath still shallow, but not as strained. She nodded, folding her arms as the early chill nipped at her skin. "He's never stayed sick this long before." Elias didn't fill the silence. He let it settle, like he understood that worry had to be spoken in pieces. Keziah knelt beside the fire, watching the flames lick around the kettle's belly. "Did you build all this before sunrise?" He pulled a pine twig from his pocket, stripped the bark, and set it aside for kindling. "Couldn't sleep." "When I can't sleep, I work." She glanced at the neat ring of stones, the stack of dry wood, the water hauled in from the spring. "You did more than work." He shrugged with one shoulder. "I get restless if I'm not doing something useful." Keziah looked at him, then the way he sat solid and sure without trying to fill the space between them. "You always this steady?" He gave half a smile. "Not always. But I've learned what steadiness can mean to folks who need it." She didn't ask who needed it before her. Some stories stayed unspoken, and she had no right to his until he chose to offer it. Inside the cabin, Dawson stirred. She moved quickly, but Elias reached the door first, holding it open without a word. The boy's cough had eased some, but his skin was still too pale and his lips dry. She pressed a clean cloth to his forehead and coaxed him to drink from a tin cup filled with warm water and a pinch of salt. Later, while Dawson napped under a quilt Elias had found in the trunk at the foot of the bed, Keziah stepped outside again, this time with a bundle of damp laundry. A clothesline had appeared between 2 trees, taut and neat. Elias was splitting pine nearby, his shirt sleeves rolled high, arms steady on the axe handle. "This place," she said, clipping Dawson's shirt to the line. "It's like you knew we'd need it. I used to come here summers, years back. My uncle ran the trail drives out of Cheyenne. He'd stop here when he needed quiet." She turned to him, the wind tugging at her skirt hem. "You said it was empty." He set the axe down and wiped his palms on his trousers. "It is. He passed last winter, no kin left to claim it." She watched his face, the way his jaw tightened just slightly. "You were close." "No," he said, looking off toward the trees. "But he gave me work when no one else would." Keziah didn't press. Instead, she went back to hanging clothes, the rhythm of it grounding her. When she glanced over again, Elias was watching her quietly, a question behind his eyes. "You could go back to town," she said, not turning. "I know you've got work waiting." "I sent word by a rider yesterday," he said. "Drayton owes me a week's leave. I told him I'd be gone too." She looked at him then, fully. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She didn't answer, but something inside her shifted, softened. That evening, as dusk crept into the corners of the forest, Elias sat on the cabin's stoop, whittling a reed into a whistle while Keziah stirred a pot of beans over the fire. Dawson lay on the cot, dozing but calmer, his breath no longer labored. "I used to dream of a place like this," she said, keeping her eyes on the bubbling stew. "Not the cabin exactly, just somewhere far enough that no one could find me." "You think someone's still looking?" She shook her head. "No, but the fear doesn't always go away just because the danger does." Elias leaned back, resting the reed on his knee. "You still carry it." "I carry what I've had to survive." She turned toward him. "You don't ask for details. I don't need them to know you've done right by that boy." She looked at him long, the lines of his face outlined in firelight. "You ever think about settling down?" "Used to," he said, eyes steady on hers. "Didn't think it had come back to me until now." Keziah didn't look away. "It's hard to believe someone could see all of me and still want to stay. I wouldn't have stayed if I didn't." The wind moved through the trees again, softer this time. She walked to the doorframe and stood beside him, the night falling quiet around them. "I'm not used to trusting someone who didn't ask for anything in return." Elias didn't reach for her. He just stayed where he was, steady as ever. "I'm not asking. I'll earn it if it's worth building." In the hush that followed, Keziah felt something inside her loosen, something that had been pulled tight for years. Not gone, not healed, but looser. Behind them, Dawson stirred again, and Elias rose without a word to check on him. She watched the way he moved, sure and quiet, and in that moment, it felt less like running and more like arriving. By the fourth day in the hills, the heavy rasp in Dawson's chest had eased into quiet sleep. He lay curled beneath the patchwork quilt, breath slow and even, one arm wrapped around the pine fox Elias had carved. The fever had passed. Keziah could feel it in the coolness of his skin, in the way color had returned, faint but real, to his cheeks. She stepped outside, exhaling slowly as the door clicked shut behind her. The sun was low, its light slanting gold through the trees. Elias was further off today, kneeling by the stream bed, sleeves damp past the elbows as he dug at the mossy edge with a flat stone. She watched him a moment before walking down the slope, her boots soft in the pine needles. "What are you after down there?" she asked. He looked up, brushing his hands on his trousers as he stood. "Saw signs of trout upstream. Thought I'd try setting a line before dark." She crouched beside the water, dipping her fingers in and watching the ripples spread. "You always know how to make a place livable." Elias took a seat on a flat rock nearby, resting his arms on his knees. "I spent most of my life in places that didn't care if you stayed alive or not. You learn to make your own shelter where you can." Keziah kept her gaze on the stream. "You ever think of building something more permanent? Something that doesn't move with the seasons?" His reply came after a long pause. "I've thought about it more these past few days than I have in years." She didn't answer right away. The water gurgled between them, steady and cold. Overhead, a hawk circled once, then disappeared beyond the ridge. "I don't know what it would look like," she said finally. a life that doesn't shift under your feet. It might look like this, he said quietly. She turned to face him. You don't know me well enough to say. I know enough. You don't flinch from hard work. You carry your fear without letting it carry you. You read to your boy when you're bone tired. You didn't run when I saw through the story you told. Her voice caught. I thought you might. I don't run from things worth staying for. Keziah rose and stood still for a breath, the trees whispering above. I'm not used to someone wanting a future with all the pieces of me. Elias looked up at her. Then let me be the first. She walked slowly back toward the cabin, heart thudding in her chest. She didn't look back, but she felt him watching, not with judgment, just with quiet certainty. That evening, after Dawson fell asleep again, Elias took out a worn book from his saddlebag and laid it on the table. Found this on the Drayton line years back. Kept it even after the leather started cracking. Keziah opened it, brushing dust from the cover. Surveying and field notes, she read aloud. Wasn't always planning to cowboy. Spent a season with a surveying crew before the war, thought I'd make maps. What changed? I saw what the war took from the men who came back. Didn't want to measure land that was marked by graves. She turned a few pages, stopping at a folded sketch of a valley with hand-drawn ridgelines. You made this? I did. She looked up at him. You could still do this. Maybe. But I think I'd rather build something someone could live in. Keziah closed the book and ran her fingers across the worn cover. Why show me this? Because I want you to know I can do more than ride and fix hinges. I want to build something that holds, Keziah. She didn't speak, but she reached out and placed her hand over his. For a long time they sat at the table, the lamplight soft around them. Outside, the night deepened, and the scent of pine smoke drifted in through the open window. In the quiet that followed, she made a choice she hadn't dared to before. She whispered, I never told you his name, Dawson, his father's. Elias didn't move, didn't press her to continue. Thomas Everett, she said, voice steady. Son of a judge, he promised marriage once. Then he married someone else, a banker's daughter, with silk gloves and a dowry. Elias's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. I left before the rumors started, before my father could turn me out. I had nothing but a child and a name I couldn't use. You don't owe me this, Elias said. I know. But I want you to know who I was before all this. He looked at her then, deeply, without pity. You're not who he left. You're who you chose to become. Tears welled behind her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She reached for his hand again, and this time he held it longer. That night, when the wind rose through the trees, Keziah didn't lie awake listening for footsteps in the dark. She slept with the quilt pulled to her chin and her son breathing easy beside her. Outside, Elias kept watch by the fire, one hand resting on the carving knife in his lap, the other on the book of maps he carried not for memory, but for hope. The cabin roof creaked in the heat of midday, resin weeping slow from the pine beams. Keziah stood at the edge of the clearing with a basket under one arm, watching the narrow trail that wound down through the trees toward Rivet Creek. It had been over a week since they'd left town. The quiet of the hills had settled into her bones, but practical matters still pulled at her thoughts. Salt, flour, the last of the oats nearly gone. Dawson sat on a sun-warmed rock nearby, poking a stick into the soft earth, his cheeks fuller again, the gray from his skin replaced by a faint flush. His cough had thinned to nothing. He hummed to himself, tuneless and content. Elias emerged from the trees with a rabbit hanging from one hand, the other gripping a length of snare wire. His shirt clung damp to his back, and there were pine needles stuck to the cuffs of his trousers. Set 3 more lines above the ridge, he said, laying the rabbit on a flat-top stump. Found sign of deer too, but they're keeping to the higher brush. Keziah nodded, shifting the basket to her other hip. I need to ride into town tomorrow. We're near out of stores. I'll go with you, she hesitated. I can manage. I don't doubt that, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. But I'd rather folks see we came back together. She looked at him, brows drawn. Why? He met her gaze without pause. Because I want them to know I'm not just passing through. I don't want there to be questions about what I intend. Her chest tightened. "And what do you intend? To stay?" The wind stirred through the trees. Dawson glanced up, then went back to his stick drawings. Keziah lowered her voice. "If we do this, there's no turning it around later. Dawson, he's not just a part of my life, he's the whole of it. I figured that out the first time I saw you wrap your shawl around both of you instead of just yourself." She swallowed hard. "You say things like they're simple. They are. If you want them to be." That night, they sat on the floor near the hearth after Dawson drifted to sleep. The fire was low, more glow than heat. Elias leaned back against the wall with his long legs stretched out, a tin cup resting between his hands. "I've been thinking," he said. "Drayton's been talking about fencing the north pasture. He'll need hands who can do more than ride. You'd stay on with him, for now, but I've got some money put by, not much but enough to start something small, a place of our own if you'd want it." She didn't answer right away. Her hands were folded in her lap, fingers woven tight. "I never thought beyond tomorrow," she said. "Not since Missouri, not since I left everything I knew with a sick infant and a lie in my mouth." He didn't move, just waited. "I started that shop with borrowed coin and no name to lean on. I've lived every day since expecting someone would find a reason to take it from me. No one's going to take it. You can't promise that. I can promise I'll stand beside you if they try." She looked at him then, really looked. The lines at the corners of his eyes, the quiet certainty in the way he held still when the world felt like it might shift underfoot. "Would you be content with a woman like me?" she asked. "One who's had to scrape and claw for every scrap of peace. I don't want contentment, Keziah. I want truth." "I want you." She leaned toward him slowly, the space between them narrowing until the firelight touched both their faces. "I've spent years keeping my head down," she murmured, "but I don't want to hide anymore." His hand found hers, warm and sure. "Then don't." The next morning they packed what they needed at dawn. Dawson rode with Elias, perched in front of the saddle, his small hands gripping the horn. Keziah followed on her mare, the saddle pack light and fastened tight. The trail back to Rivet Creek was quiet, broken only by the sound of hooves and the wind moving through dry grass. When the town came into view, Keziah's breath caught in her throat. The rooftops, the faint smell of smoke from cook fires, the bell on the chapel steeple, all of it familiar but changed. They rode straight to the shop. The door was just as she left it, the windows dusty but intact. Elias helped Dawson down, then stepped back as Keziah unlocked the door. Inside, the air was close and still. She opened both front windows, letting the light spill in. She turned to Elias. "If you're sure I'll clear the back room, you can stay there for now," he nodded. "I'll earn my keep." "You already have." They spent the rest of the day cleaning. Keziah swept the dust from the shelves while Elias patched a loose shutter. Dawson dozed behind the counter on a folded quilt, the pine fox tucked under his chin. As the sun dipped low, Elias leaned against the doorframe, watching the street. "You think they'll talk?" Keziah asked, stacking tins behind the counter. "Likely. You care?" He looked at her over his shoulder. "Do you?" She shook her head. "Not anymore." He crossed the room in 3 strides and took her hand, pressing it gently to his chest. "This is where I want to be," he said. "With you, with him." She held his gaze, and when she nodded, it wasn't out of fear or doubt. It was a promise returned. Outside, the town moved on wagons creaking past, boots scuffing boardwalks, the world turning as it always had. But inside that small mercantile, something had shifted, and it would hold. The first rain of September came just after sundown, soft and steady against the windows of the shop. Keziah stood at the back door, drying a pot she'd brought in from the porch shelf, her sleeves pushed to her forearms. The lamp on the counter cast long shadows, and the scent of the stew Elias had set to simmer drifted through the room, sharp with wild onion and bay leaf. Dawson sat near the stove with a slate across his knees, tongue between his teeth as he copied a passage from the worn primer Keziah had brought west. Elias leaned over his shoulder now and then, pointing to a crooked letter or offering a nod when the boy corrected it. Neither of them spoke much. They never needed to. Keziah stepped back into the warm room and tied her apron behind her waist. "You think he's ready for school with the others?" Elias asked, glancing up from Dawson's slate. "He's ahead of most," she said. "But I don't know if that's what's best for him yet." "He's got grit," Elias said. "Doesn't flinch when he makes a mistake, just keeps after it." She ran a hand along the edge of the counter. "He watches you, he follows your lead." Elias set the slate aside and tousled Dawson's hair gently. "You want him to learn, he'll learn. He's got your mind." Keziah didn't answer, but her eyes lingered where Elias's hand had been. There was a steadiness in the way he touched her son, not possessive, not performative, just present. That night, after Dawson had been tucked beneath his blanket and the lamp turned low, Elias lingered beside the shop's front door. He traced the frame with one hand, fingers brushing the old notches where the wood had splintered from years of opening and closing. "I've been thinking on something," he said. Keziah folded a scrap of cloth over the bread she'd baked earlier. "You've been thinking a lot lately." He glanced over his shoulder, expression unreadable. "I asked Drayton if he'd sell me 2 milk cows and a pair of geldings." "He said yes," she straightened. "You planning to start a herd? Not big. Just enough to work a few acres and keep trade going. I saw a piece of land west of the creek, near the ridge. It's clear, good soil, a spring not far off." She set the bread aside slowly. "That land's been sitting idle for years. Owner died without kin. County clerk said it could be leased long-term or bought outright if I had a sponsor with standing in town." Her brow furrowed. "I don't have that kind of pull." "No," he said, "but Mr. Albridge does. He said he'd vouch for me if—" Elias paused, shifting his weight. "If it was for something that would last." Keziah moved toward him, voice low. "You mean to stay here, start a place, build it from the ground up?" "I mean to build it with you." Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. "You're sure?" "I've never been more." She stepped close enough to rest her hand against his chest. "I'm not a woman people admire, I'm tolerated. You tie yourself to me, you'll carry what I carry. I'll carry it gladly." They stood in the quiet, the rain soft against the roof, the lamp flickering behind them. "I wouldn't know what to do with a big dress or a preacher's sermon," she said. "I'm not asking for either," Elias murmured. "I'm asking if you'll wake beside me each morning and let me call you mine." "I already do," she whispered, and she meant it. They married at the clerk's office a week later, with Dawson standing between them holding Elias's hand. Keziah wore a dark blue dress she'd sewn herself, and Elias tied a clean kerchief around his neck, his boots polished to a dull shine. There was no crowd, just Mr. Albridge signing witness and the clerk nodding through the vows. No one asked questions. No one needed to. By the end of that month, the claim west of the creek was theirs. Elias built the first fence post with Dawson watching, hammering the nails slow so the boy could learn the rhythm. Keziah planted beans in neat rows behind the cabin's back wall, her hands in the earth and the sun on her shoulders. The shop stayed open 3 days a week, enough to keep trade going and conversation flowing. The women in town began to linger longer at the counter, asking after the boy's health, offering seeds or jars of jam. The shape of her place in town shifted not all at once, but like riverwater carving stone. Steady, patient. One evening after supper, with the lantern lit low and the air warm from the stove, Dawson curled up on the rug with a book in his lap, lips moving soundlessly as he read. "You ever regret it?" Elias asked, brushing wood shavings from his trousers. Keziah looked up from her mending. "Regret what?" Walking into that shop with a handful of horseshoe nails. She smiled, soft and quiet. "Not once." Elias reached for her hand and pressed it to his lips. "Then I reckon we've done all right." Years passed, marked by seasons and harvests. The cabin grew into a home, new rafters, a second room tucked on, a porch swing built by Elias and painted by Dawson. The boy grew tall, shoulders steady, hands calloused by work and worn smooth by books. He asked once when he was older if he could take Elias's last name. Elias didn't answer right away. He just laid a hand on the boy's shoulder and nodded once. When snow came and the wind howled through the cottonwoods, Elias kept the fire lit and the walls sealed tight. Keziah baked bread that filled the cabin with warmth, and Dawson read aloud from the Book of Psalms by lamplight. They had no riches, but they had each other. And in that life quiet, honest, hard-earned, there was more joy than any fortune could buy. Keziah never wondered again if someone could love all the parts of her. She lived it every day in the way Elias looked at her, the way he worked beside her without complaint, the way he held her hand at night beneath the quilt they'd stitched together. And when they sat on the porch in the evenings, the sun sinking red over the ridge, she would rest her head on his shoulder and know, without a word, that this was the life she'd fought for, a life that had found her and stayed.